Welcome to the Jill on Money podcast. It's Sunday, June 20th. Happy Father's Day. Happy Father's Day to all of you fathers out there and to anyone who is celebrating Father's Day and missing their father. I know how that feels. So here's to you, Big Al. Sorry you're missing all the fun these days. Today, we are airing the second part of our interview with economist Diane Swonk. She's the chief economist, actually, of Grant Thornton. Today, we're going to discuss what's going on with inflation. Is it likely to persist? And what's going on in the housing market? Here is the second part of our interview with Diane Swonk. Okay, so let's talk about inflation, which is rising prices. So, All right, so I go on network TV and I give them the Diane Swonk mantra. Number one, we are comparing where we were to a year ago. And a year ago, we were frozen solid. We did not have an economy, right?
Right.
Number two, supply chain issues, which are weird. And three, there is surging demand. Do you expect inflation to be higher for longer than maybe Jay Powell thinks? So right now, if let's say we look at 2 years ago, we're up 2.5% from 2 years ago. 2.5% is way hotter than it's been in the previous decade. So what should we expect in terms of inflation going forward?
This is the great unknown, right? And I really think the Fed did a poor job of preparing the markets and the overall economy for what a flare in inflation was going to look like. It was not hard. Several months ago, I had in a piece, we can get by May 5% inflation year over year on CPI. There we are. Wasn't hard to do given the fact that some prices fell a year ago and that prices were flaring and that these bottlenecks, we've got a global pandemic and you've still got a pandemic anywhere is a pandemic everywhere. You've still got a pandemic going on in parts of the world, even in China, which is still mucking up the supply chain. There is a good argument to believe that we will see much of this inflation. It was going to shift as we shift away from, the fact that consumers say, hey, we've had it. They got, $2 trillion amassed in savings along with all the stimulus we've got out there. And, in July, the child tax credits and the monthly payments kick in for families to help them out a little bit to maybe get some childcare. But, these are important things because, you've got all this amassed, yet consumers said, I don't like what you're asking for cars right now. It's a little too expensive. I don't like what houses cost. I don't care how low mortgage rates are. And their attitudes soured. High prices are the ultimate corrector of high prices, right? It's the bridge between supply and demand. And it either brings supply up, which it's doing, or it brings demand down, which is also doing both of those things. Then you're going to rotate into, airfares, everything, returning hotel room rates and surge pricing. I think we'll see inflation calm down as we get into 2022. But is it going to calm down enough for the Fed not to get a little bit antsy on their patience and worry more about inflation? And that's, I really think, one of the biggest policy mistakes. There's a lot of room for error here. And one of the errors that I think is likely is that the Fed, many on the Fed feel they're getting behind the curve on inflation. You saw that they're worried about it. They're not tone deaf. They see the prices and they're surprised. And they could get a little more aggressive on rate hikes because we're compressing everything.
Okay, wait. So let's say if you say prices should calm down by 2022, what do you think that means? So let's use our baseline. Let's say 2.5% would be a little bit hot and they'd have to look at it. But what do you think that if we get into 2022, what do you think we're looking at in terms of price increases? What percentage do you think will be up by year over year?
By the end of 2022, I think the, core PCE, which is what the Fed watches, I think that's going to be a little warmer than 2. And that's what they say they want. That's excluding food and energy, but the shelter costs are going up. They say they want that. The question is, will they actually live with it once they get there?
And more than 2 is what? 2.5, 3?
2.25, yeah.
2.25.
2.25.
Is your view that Powell is really going to try to hold the line on this?
I think it's very difficult for him to hold the line on overshooting on inflation when you're the head of a central bank that's a central bank to the world. And and they won't know for sure. But it's easy to make a mistake, and it's easy to then bring rates up. The question is how rapidly. And, they want to go slow, and they're thinking about the last decade, but there's nothing that tells us this won't be anything like the last decade.
Right.
I mean, some of the things that are in place, as he said, are still in place. But we also had, the good news is what could help all this? We all learned to use all this electronics that we didn't know how to use, that we had sitting on our desks, and we didn't know how to use them to their fullest, certainly, or in our palms of our hands. And we learned to use and adopt existing technologies in ways we never thought possible. And you're eliminating some jobs permanently due to that. You already see it. You go and you can make your whole order without ever, and pay for it without ever talking to a person. Even in a restaurant sitting down, I just did that sitting outside with my son somewhere. So those things are important that could offset some of these inflationary pressures that we see. But I think it's going to be hard. And I think that there's a risk that we get in. I don't want to get in a boom bust cycle. I like the boom, and we want a long expansion. And this is going to be hard. And I was running the numbers yesterday, Lifter, like if some of the most aggressive people on the Fed were to be king for a day from those dot plots that we see, you can get this economy on thin ice and feeling pretty chilly by the end of 2023, early 2024. Ugh. And you could slip through again in 2024. And that's something that, I worry about. Now, it would take really aggressive moves, but, that it's a possibility is worrisome because, boy, we know recessions disproportionately affect certain people. Inflation, you don't want to tolerate it to a point that it erodes purchasing power and we have a repeat of the 70s. But, I grew up in the 70s. Remember, 80% of wages in the 70s were, set by cost of living adjustments that were tied to the CPI. It was baked into the cake. Any increase you saw in gas prices, you're going to get in wages. But it created a vicious cycle.
And it is interesting that a lot of money managers, and there's a lot of investors who have grown up in a period where they've never experienced inflation, which is so fascinating, right?
None. I mean, we're at the, yes, it is fascinating. And, there's no muscle memory for this.
No, none. Okay. Diane Swonk, housing market, completely insane. Shortage of houses. Will this get worked out over time, or are we going into another weird housing boom?
This is a really great question. So first of all, consumers have already said, we don't like these high prices. And home sales have come off their highs. Builders are frustrated because they can't get materials, they can't get workers, and they can't build the homes. And even as lumber prices and material prices come down, they're still way higher than they were pre-pandemic. And so they can't build the number of homes they want to build. And, it's really hard because it's crowding out first-time buyers. The other thing that's happening is investors have returned to the market, institutional investors, to buy homes, to new homes, to flip them to rent instead of sell. And they're making, Houston's huge in this market, and they're making really good money on that, on the rentals. And that is, also further distorting the market and keeping first-time buyers out of the market of owning a home and moving up that ladder of wealth creation. And millennials were already late to the game. They were delayed because they graduated into the Great Recession and the financial crisis, and were delayed because of that. And they finally got some catch up, and now they're frustrated. A lot of our problems is not having affordable housing. It is a lot of the zoning laws that we see in cities that actually are that work against climate change, that make things less dense and more urban sprawl. And, even having 2 and 3 flats in a city, it's banned in many places now, which is what made many cities beautiful, actually. And that was a way to get people into home ownership. And also they could rent it out to one of their relatives or to someone else. They could live above someone they were renting to. All of those dynamics, we're derailing the path to building wealth, which is really important. And also we're not building enough affordable housing because of these local zoning laws. So the housing market, it's already cooling on its own because price is its own equalizer. And even at these low rates, it's gotten to be ridiculous. That doesn't mean we won't see some of this show up in inflation. It will. It comes in a weird way in the inflation numbers, and it takes a while, but it does show up. And that's why I'm a little warmer on inflation than some as we get into 2022 than others as we get into 2022. But I think, this is something that you really have to start thinking about is, a lot of baby boomers are sellers think this is the best time to list. And they're finally listing, and buyers say it's the worst time to buy since the height of the pandemic. That will equalize some things. Obviously, but
is it fair to say? We often will get questions from people who are like, "Okay, I've been outbid 25 times. Is it fair to say, like, rent for a while, chill out, see where we are in a year?"
Yeah.
I mean, like, it seems crazy to enter this market in a frenzy.
And I think all the urgency, I mean, we know that, the low mortgage rates unleashed what was really a huge amount of pent-up demand from first-time buyers that hadn't yet bought. And then they needed space all at once.
Right.
And it created an urgency. And that urgency is abating. All of a sudden, the minute you buy a home, what do you buy? You buy a car. They go 1, 2, they go together. And, all that urgency really had distorted the markets. And, the market couldn't clear in the period of time it needed. And then also people bought second homes. They bought big cars, and pickup trucks are the thing now. It's a lifestyle thing. They don't even use the back of the pickup truck, but they want to tow their boats because that was how they, spent their pandemic and quarantine.
Work from home, hybrid work, here to stay, or maybe jumping the gun on that trend?
I find it interesting. So it will be here for a while. And the question is, how will it evolve? And I think people are looking at it as a revolution instead of an evolution. I have to tell you, in my office, they had flexible time on Fridays, and, because I had economic data coming out on Friday, my team had to be there. And so we were there on Fridays, but you could roll bowling balls around because people were working effectively from home, and it increased their productivity 1 day a week working from home instead of being in the office. That's a little different than what we all had to do in the middle of this crisis. Work from, I live from work instead of work from home, I think is the way I think of it. And I'm 6 feet away from my full TV studio in this office right now I'm sitting in, which was once my daughter's room, and she's upset that I reclaimed it and redecorated it. It really is an interesting issue because I look at the tech behemoths and I look at the financial CEOs, and they're all the ones that are the first ones that are snapping up space in real estate markets in places like downtown New York. It's because what do you lose? You lose the mentoring and the networking that you need in your young people. And then all of a sudden you wonder why they're being poached when we've got people who've never been in an office before with us.
What do you think about David Solomon of Goldman Sachs, James Gorman from Morgan Stanley, that they've come out really kind of hardcore and said, like, I don't want to see people in restaurants if they're not in the office?
I'm not in agreement on that side of it. I think we've got some hybrid of work from home. I think we're going to find that it's really hard to get all the people we need to get in the people in an office at the same time. And I also think we figured out that some things are actually done better, remote and virtual.
Well, thanks again to Diane Swonk. She's such a great friend, and I really am so grateful for her. She's always willing to share her wisdom with us, even when she's kind of shoehorning us into lots of other things. So thank you to Diane, and thank you for listening, because you know what? This show, it's all about you and trying to give you the best kind of content we can, the kind that will help you get through your days. Now, that can be a little economic boot camp, but it can also be answering your financial questions. Don't forget to send us your questions. The email address, askjill@jillonmoney.com, askjill@jillonmoney.com. And today, why don't you do something nice, not just for your father, do something nice for someone else today. It's going to make you feel better. I tell you, it will. Grit, growth, grace. Happy Father's Day, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.